Hi everybody, welcome to another conversation with myself, Clare Farrell, and Dr Charlie Gardner.
Hello.
This is our series, News from a World in Flux. We're trying to look in depth at issues that may be of significance to the climate space. Sometimes that's about science, sometimes it's also about politics, sometimes it's about the movement. And today we're going to be having a conversation, first of all, about ocean temperatures and coral bleaching, devastating news on that front. And later we'll come on to the sort of political context in this country, which includes, is not limited to, but includes a lot of focus at the moment on somebody called John Woodcock, who is also known as Lord Walney. We both met with him in 2021, so we thought we'd do a bit of a reflection on what's happened, since as we were both involved with XR in conversation with him way back. First of all then, let's talk about the oceans. Why are coral reefs important and what's the news about them?
So coral reefs are really important because they're the most rich and diverse part of the oceans. They're just full of fish and other kinds of wildlife. They only cover about 1% of the oceans, but they harbour 25% of all marine biodiversity. So they're really, really important for marine wildlife, but also for people, because you know those fish that live on coral reefs provide food for people. 500 million people around the world depend on coral reefs for their primary source of dietary protein.
Wow.
So really, really important. But corals are really, really sensitive to ocean temperatures, and as a result they're really struggling at the minute. The oceans have been getting hotter and hotter because most of the heat that enters our Earth system is absorbed by the oceans. Mm-hmm. We're always focusing on the temperature of the air, but that's not been going up so fast because all the heat's been absorbed by the oceans. And most of this heat has just been being absorbed deep down until recently and not making the surface of the oceans hotter. But just this last couple of years, the surface of the oceans are getting really, really hot, and in a scary way. So in the North Atlantic, we've just now passed a year, I think it was just a couple of days ago, we passed a year of 365 consecutive record days. Like every day for the last year, the oceans have been hotter than they ever have been on that day before. And you know, we're always talking about smashing all these records here, there and everywhere, but you know, smashing a record every day for 365 days in a row is really, really extraordinary. Extreme. Yeah. I remember we did an episode last year where at the time we briefly mentioned that the waters around Florida were as hot as a bath, right? Mm. That's how hot it was. And of course, all the life in the oceans can't deal with this heat. And corals are particularly sensitive because, so I don't know how much everyone knows about coral reefs. You know, we see these big structures under the water, but they're actually made up of they're colonies of tiny, tiny animals called coral polyps. And for the coral to live, it needs more than just a polyp. There's a symbiosis between the coral polyp and an alga. These algae are called zooxanthellae. Don't need to remember the name. But basically, it's the algae that produce the energy for the coral. When the water's too hot, the coral expels the alga. And that's what bleaching is. So they lose their colour and they go white. So the algae,
Just to get this clear, because I don't know much about how coral actually works, the algae is
it lives inside with the coral polyp, right. But then when it gets warm, and I don't know quite how or why, but the coral polyp kicks it out. So the coral loses its colour, loses its source of energy. If temperatures cool down again before the coral dies, then it doesn't die immediately. So if there's just a heat wave for a couple of days or a couple of weeks, the coral will bleach, but it can come back to life. If the heat wave is sustained, the coral will die. Now, coral bleaching was a completely unknown phenomenon until like the 60s or 70s. It had never existed on Earth before. so there've been 5, I think, global bleaching events, but 2016 and 2017 were particularly bad. They were so bad that they killed half of the Great Barrier Reef. Not just temporarily bleached it, but killed it. So, wow. And I just, I don't think most people are aware of this. We talk about the Great Barrier Reef. It's one of the great natural wonders of the world, right? Everyone knows how amazing this place, the Great Barrier Reef, is. Half of it is dead just in the last few years, just because the waters are getting so warm. Now, the really scary thing is predictions for what's going to happen in the sort of next bleaching season, which is, so next winter, when it's summer in the southern hemisphere, so 24, 25, it's predicted, according to a new paper that just came out at the end of last year, it's predicted that all of the corals in the entire southern hemisphere will bleach this year. And of course, we don't know how severe it will be. We don't know if it will be severe enough to kill them, but it's predicted that all the corals in the entire southern hemisphere may bleach in this next year. And it's just devastating to think of, what the impacts this might have. And of course, coral bleaching isn't, warm waters aren't the only thing that corals are suffering from. They, and in fact, they're suffering sort of death by 1,000 cuts because they're under all sorts of different pressures. For example, when there's lots of fishing on a coral reef, fisher folk tends to catch many of the herbivorous fish, the ones that graze algae, and then when they're gone, there's no one to graze the algae, so the algae starts to outcompete the coral a bit, so that's another pressure on the coral. It's also the case that because of deforestation inland, there's now lots of sediment and soil going into the rivers, and then when the rivers go out, discharge out into the sea, there's all this soil which is like, it's making the water turbid, it's not clear anymore, so there's no light penetrating through, and all this like silt is settling over the corals, so they can't function as well. Then there's ocean acidification, which is a whole other thing. So ocean acidification is not an impact of climate change, but it is an impact of greenhouse gases. So when we emit lots of greenhouse gases, we tend to think that all of them just go into the atmosphere, right, and cause global heating. In fact, about a quarter of our greenhouse gas emissions are absorbed by soils and trees and stuff, and they go into what we call land sinks. About a quarter of it is absorbed by the ocean, and half of it goes into the atmosphere where it causes climate change. The problem with all the carbon dioxide being absorbed by the ocean is that it makes the ocean slightly less acidic. It turns to carbonic acid and it makes the ocean slightly less acidic. All right, slightly more acidic, less alkaline. Ocean acidification. All right, so ocean's a bit more acidic. What's the problem? Well, corals, as well as anything else in the ocean that has a shell, they have to create their shell, right, out of calcium carbonate. It's basically limestone. In a more acidic ocean, they can't create this calcium carbonate. So any animal that has a shell is finding it more and more difficult to create its shell. That goes for coral as well. When they build their big colonies, they're building them out of calcium carbonate. So what these corals are facing now is they can't build the structures because the ocean's acidic. They're getting killed by heating. They're getting smothered by soil. They're getting, the ecology is changing because the herbivorous fish are getting eaten. They're just all these different pressures on coral. And, they'd be more resilient to the heating if there wasn't all these other problems with the fishing and the sediment and all the rest of it.
Can I ask you about two other things that might be affecting them that I'm aware of in the ocean? The first one is nitrogen runoff. Is that also a problem for coral, where you've got the algae blooms and those kinds of issues?
I don't know if it is specifically, but I would imagine that it is. So what this is about is when we put lots of fertilizers on, far too many fertilizers on agricultural land, rain comes, it washes it off, goes into the river, and then that goes into the ocean. So we've got all this fertility there, like nitrates and phosphates, and that's normally the critical thing that's missing. When you have the fertility, as you say, lots and lots of algae grow, and you get these big algal blooms. The problem is then when the algae die, that sucks all the oxygen out of the water, and it becomes what they call an anoxic dead zone. And
Sounds
just
nice.
anything that needs oxygen cannot be alive in that water. I don't know specifically what happens to corals when an anoxic dead zone washes over them. I think maybe it might not be so much of an issue because the dead zones are in deeper waters and corals are in shallow waters.
Right.
But a coral that was in an algal bloom would suffer, certainly.
And then the other one, which is a bit of a sort of personal interest of mine, is forever chemicals. So my understanding of, you know, creating these very chemically durable molecules that we can use as water repellents and flame retardants and go in all sorts of different things, sun creams and stuff. There's some research, isn't there, that thinks, particularly from, I think his name's Howard Dryden, the researcher. He's a bit of a sort of citizen science project of sort of analysing plankton levels in the ocean. And I think his perspective is that the pollution of forever chemicals in the ocean, the scale of it, in combination with microfibers, microplastics, is significantly undermining the survival and growth rates of plankton in the ocean.
Okay. Yeah, I have come across that research a while ago. I can't remember it well enough to comment on, but I'd say, you know, the big concern for me is that we simply do not know what impacts these things will have. And you know, just the range of different chemicals we are throwing into our ocean systems all the time, and yeah, microplastics and other pollutants, we simply don't know, because you know, the oceans are hugely complex. There are tens of thousands of different species in there, and we don't know what impact these chemicals will have. And this has always been the case. We just don't have the testing before we allow these things to go into production. We don't even know what effects they're going to have on human beings over the long term, let alone what effects they're going to have over the oceans, because we simply, you know, you can't do the tests that will test what happens when you're exposed to these things over 30 years, because if you're to do that test, then the thing wouldn't go into production for 30 years. And of course, the private sector won't allow that. So the testing is simply insufficient. With these forever chemicals, PFASs, I think they are, we know, you know, what we know about them is right there in the main. They do not break down, they do not go away, they accumulate. And I think the only way to deal safely with these things is to adopt a precautionary principle. If it might be dangerous, don't do it. Don't do it until you know it's not dangerous. And the precautionary principle, it's a legal principle. It's enshrined into law in multiple pieces of global legislation. The United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which is what the Paris Agreement and before it the Kyoto Protocol were part of. The precautionary principle is enshrined into law. And yet it's just completely ignored all the time. The ethos, the philosophy of our economy is just try stuff, do it, and if it's bad, we'll stop it later. And it's the opposite of a precautionary principle. I really think, you know, things would be a lot better if we just said, no, let's make sure it's not bad before we do it.
Yeah. Well, I learnt about forever chemicals because of my background in fashion, and I was researching how to make waterproof clothing without harmful chemicals involved in the production. So I researched quite hard into durable water resistant chemicals. And, you know, from that then discovered the whole story around the DuPont cover up, which led to the film Dark Waters, which is brilliant. It just exposes this sort of like long running hiding of the horrendous birth defects and health impacts that factory was having on the workforce, and particularly on women. And instead of tackling the obvious, like, extreme toxicity of their product. They buried the evidence, laid off the women, didn't let them work in that department anymore, only let men work there. As a story that sort of shows you how, for me, like, my industry, the fashion industry, is connected to, like, big chemical companies and those kinds of practices that totally fly in the face of anything that you've just mentioned around precaution, all because they're marking their own homework, you know, they run their own tests, and then after however many years you discover that, I don't know, a product like Scotchgard is actually really, really harmful to human health. You take it off the market and you replace it with something quite similar. And then you wait for that to be discovered, what's the health impact of that? Then you take that off the market, then you replace it with something else. And in the literature that I've looked at, you know, there's a lot of interest in the textile sector for a long time in nanotechnology, different chemicals that you can use. I mean, miraculous treatments, like you could get a piece of fabric and make it completely hydrophobic and you wouldn't notice a single thing about the handle of it. You can't notice that it's there, it's working on a nanoscale. But the knowledge gap on that type of chemistry is about 20 years. So you're going to put something on the market for 20 years and then go, oh shit, you know, and that's literally how business operates around chemicals, isn't it? It's such a, I just think it's such a massively overlooked area, if you know what I mean. It doesn't make it into the sort of climate movement discourse very often, does it? No.
But yeah, absolutely terrifying when we think of the cumulative effects of being exposed to the same chemical over long periods of time. But what about cumulative effects of being exposed to lots of different chemicals at the same time? Again, testing doesn't go anywhere near that at all. But yeah, I do feel that that the chemicals industry is, as you say, it's a massively under-recognised part of our planetary crisis, and it's just yet another example of the dangers of carbon tunnel vision. If we think that our planetary crisis is just about climate change, there are so many different elements to it, and that illustrates why we need such a So the IPCC and the IPBES, which is the biodiversity equivalent of the IPCC, both are very, very clear. We need transformative change across every aspect of our economies and societies. And, you know, replacing fossil fuels with renewable energies doesn't do that, because it's not transformative change. There are so many problems that we can't just address them individually. We need to change the system that is driving all these problems. I'm just thinking about chemicals. I don't actually know, but is the chemical industry, I presume lots of chemicals are derived from hydrocarbons. Does the chemical industry have links with fossil fuel industry? Is it dependent on the fossil fuel industry?
Yeah, I think a lot of it probably is completely interwoven. I couldn't tell you the specifics about which parts, but I'm certain that there'll be deep, deep connections. From the textile perspective, because that's my area, you know, the fibre industry is producing synthetic fibres, which relies entirely on fossil fuel inputs to make them. And then that sort of takes you on a journey through dye stuffs, surfactants, softeners, printing inks, different treatments that make your textiles do different stuff, right? You put amazing things on textiles now that means you don't have to iron anything, or that things can't get stained, or protect textiles with different stuff. And all of those kind of industries are much, much bigger than anyone really realises, because before you get a garment, the textile that it's made of has probably gone through an average of 40 different processes. So, you know, it's a long, complex supply chain. That's why I always think looking at the planetary crisis, climate crisis, and environmental problems through the lens of the fashion industry is actually a really good position to look from, because yes, it's dependent on the fossil fuel industry. Yes, it's consumerism and hyper-consumerism. It's also full of human rights abuses. It's also built off the back of colonialism. Supply chains still track a lot of those geographies. So I mean, like
And then waste issues too.
And the waste issues and stuff. So and the lack of recycling, the stories about recycling that are total bullshit, and the reality of the non-recycling that's going on, the piles of waste in Ghana, that's basically where we offshore all of our textile waste and call it recycling, and it ends up on fire, you know, mounting up. So to me, it's a brilliant kind of lens to put on the sort of, you know, complex supply chains and material production and what's happening in the world.
So as if all that's not depressing enough, the political situation in the UK is becoming harder and harder for people that want to do something about these crises to actually express themselves. Lord Walney's been in the news over the last couple of weeks, and as you mentioned, you and I were amongst a group of Exile members that met with him a couple of years ago, back in the immediate post-lockdown days. We all met on a Zoom call. Could you recap that meeting for us and what we talked about, and why is he in the news again now?
Yeah, so at that time, Boris Johnson and I think probably Priti Patel had tasked him with becoming the UK's independent commissioner on political violence and disruption. He started a kind of call for public submissions on that topic. From where I'm sitting, it was clearly an exercise in political communications and framing, because from the outset saying, you know, political violence and disruption. I remember him posting something on his Twitter feed, which was an interview with me, saying, you know, do you think it's right to do whatever I'd said? I can't remember. And then really close to that in his feed was a thing about, like, you know, violent terrorists that go out with swords or something. I mean, it was completely designed to put us all into one container, I thought, from that perspective. But we went and met with him, and we obviously said we don't meet ministers off the record or in private, so we record this meeting, which he agreed to. I don't think he wanted to agree to it at first, but he agreed to it, so we did, and we recorded it, and you can watch it, it's on YouTube. And I actually just re-listened to some of it to sort of remind myself what we discussed. And it's obvious what he's in the news, what he's in the media talking about now was his framing then, was his sort of feeling and framing back then. So he hasn't changed any of his views, I don't think, from what I could read from that meeting back in 2021. What he has got now, I suspect, is an extremely helpful, massive survey of the general public that will indicate to the Conservative Party what are the most effective arguments against protest, that people will go, yeah, I agree with that. About 2 months ago or so, he came into the news because he'd been saying, if people protest too much, like the people who are protesting against the massacre in Gaza, then potentially those people or groups should be made to pay towards the policing costs of overseeing those protests. Now, he's likening that to when you have a football club that has a particular problem with football hooligans, you know, violence, breakdown of public order, that sometimes those clubs, if they can't deal with that problem, like to make it less extreme, they have to contribute towards the excessive policing measures that have to be put in place to deal with their football fans. So he's likening protest groups or social movements to football clubs.
Disordered violence.
Well, and to football clubs,
well, yeah,
right?
Okay.
Most football clubs have got a lot of money. I'm not sure about, you know, the Stop the War Coalition or Black Lives Matter or any of the other people who this political work seems to take a very hard push against. Interestingly, I've not heard anyone mention anything about fascists or the far right or anything. You know, they're not worried about that kind of political disruption or any, you know, perhaps they just don't think that it's extreme. But it's, you know, everything that's coming out of this is pushing against the anti-war movement, the anti-racism movement and the climate movement. All of it is designed to go against that. And, you know, people have started now to use the phrase is Islamophobia because, you know, obviously with the situation at the moment with the war and the marches that are pro-Palestine, there's a big issue in British politics. And actually, as much as one side's shouting, you know, we're worried about anti-Semitism, I think there is another side that are saying, we're really worried about Islamophobia, guys. Like, and two things can be true at the same time. Both groups can be suffering under these set of circumstances. But interestingly, Lord Walney used to be the chair of Labour Friends of Israel. And a lot of his rhetoric in public has been to push really hard against the pro-Palestine marches that are happening at the moment. I feel like it's very worrying because what he's been suggesting is even, you know, is further and further and further crackdowns on people's rights to assemble, to protest, to have freedom of expression, to have freedom of speech. And just recently, he's also been in the news again with an op-ed that he released through the Sun newspaper, really great place to share your serious political views, basically saying that we should take, in this country, we should take a zero tolerance approach to the thugs and mobs that threaten our democracy. By that, he's referencing the marches for Palestine, but also just, and Extinction Rebellion, and them, and Just Stop Oil. Let's just get them in, they can go in as well. And has been saying, you know, basically, we should prevent MPs from being able to engage with these people, any of the people who organise any of this work. So,
reducing democracy to save democracy then?
Yeah. I think it was that comedian Rosie Holt. She does this impression of a Tory minister, and her joke about some of this stuff was like, you know, people say that when you really love something, you must let it go, and that's how I feel about democracy. But it does feel like that, and you know, he's got a colleague called Robin Simcox, who I've never heard of until just this week. He's the advisor who went out on the media saying that at the weekend, London is basically a no-go zone if you're Jewish, which I think probably the Jewish people I know would find that to be a pretty extraordinary and deeply unhelpful thing to say. And in addition, I think all of this ties in with the PCSC bill and really, the Police Crime Sentencing and Courts bill, which is now the Act, which is massive restrictions on freedom to protest baked into it, amongst many, many other things, including the changes to sentencing guidelines that basically means if you topple a statue, you can get a much bigger jail sentence than if you rape somebody in this country, which is, you know, the situation we live in. That bill had a really problematic clause in it, which may or may not have been pushed into the second bill because all the bits that got taken out that they couldn't get past the House of Lords just came back in a second bill, which is the Public Order Act, I think. But baked into that whole big soup of anti-democratic moves by the Conservative Party, there was a clause that was greatly contested, which basically gave the Home Secretary the right to be able to decide what does and does not constitute serious disruption. This work now that's coming out with John Woodcock saying we need to tackle people who are threatening our democracy, it's very interesting to me if you make the terms of your decision making about the level of disruption, and I'm not aware that the Palestine marches have been significantly disruptive, not in the way that Extinction Rebellion would have in the past gone and shut down central London for days on end and things like that. No comparison whatsoever.
No, they're just marches.
But the media narrative has been whipped up to say that they're extremely disruptive and it's unacceptable, and they're mobs and they're, you know, dangerous and all of this kind of stuff. So if your decision-making metrics is about how disruptive something is, then you can obviously liberally apply that to any cause or issue that you don't like at the time, particularly if you create the image of severe disruption where there is quite minor disruption actually. You know, ultimately the intention of that looks to me, and a lot of other people that I'm speaking to, like the actual intention was to really give the Home Secretary the right to choose which protests can happen and which ones can't. And of course, reflecting on all of this stuff, which you might think is sort of sitting around mostly what people would think of as the political left or the broader left kind of space, social justice issues, peace movement, climate movement. If you compare that with the farmers' protests, or if you compare that with the anti-ULEZ protests and Ian Duncan Smith saying like, it's totally legit
just go out and vandalise
blow
stuff.
them up. Somebody made a homemade device to blow up a ULEZ camera, and it was like, and it put through someone's window, where it was a child's bedroom window got blown through. And somehow, you know, that movement was massively legitimised by people in politics, in particular Ian Duncan Smith, who went on the record as saying, people have got a right to destroy these things because, guess what, they've been lied to.
But 2 weeks ago, Rishi Sunak was photographed meeting farmers' protest groups next to their tractors that they've been blocking stuff with. And there's been uproar in Germany and across Europe where there's similar things, where climate activists blocking roads with their bodies immediately arrested and sent to jail. Farmers blocking roads with tractors and like blockades set on fire. Nothing, fine. And not just fine from the police, but like the whole media ecosystem and everything, just, you know, this is legitimate protest, that's not. So this idea that left-wing or environmental or peace protest isn't legitimate and other forms of protest are okay, that's already sort of out there, and the media are sort of creating this sentiment stuff. But if there are legal mechanisms to actually differentiate or allow politicians to decide what's legitimate and what's not, that's really, really terrifying stuff, like deeply authoritarian and scary.
Yeah. Well, I'm trying to get as much information as I can about the report that Lord Walney has overseen.
Which took 2 years to come out. That's odd.
Yeah, so when we met him in 2021, he had a very particular view of our movement, which was by having more participatory, more deliberative democracy, more access to democracy in the way that we suggest.
Our third demand to have citizens' assemblies.
Yeah, that by doing that, you would probably just end up destroying democracy and not have it at all, and then implied that we wouldn't care and that we were fixated on a degrowth agenda, which is a framing of Extinction Rebellion which comes from a policy exchange report called Extremism Rebellion, which was written in 2019.
And we know the policy exchange get their money from fossil fuels and other people that we don't know.
Yeah, it was co-authored by a police officer who left under the shadow of a scandal and used to be in counter-terrorism. When we asked John on that meeting if he knew who funded that report, which had obviously shaped his entire analysis of our movement, he didn't answer. So he either didn't know or didn't want to know, or thought, oh shit, it's policy exchange, of course no one knows, or I don't know what went through his mind, but he didn't engage with that question whatsoever. And I think what's interesting is that, you know, where that report came from, which we know was a knee-jerk reaction to the success and the sort of exponential growth and impact of Extinction Rebellion, that the funding streams that have been exposed for policy exchange, the only ones I've ever seen are all big energy and big oil. And you later on had Rishi Sunak standing in front of a policy exchange backdrop at one of their events, literally openly thanking them for helping to write the new legislation. And the inspiration for the crackdown on protest now, massively embedded in that paper. In 2 years since he started that inquiry with that big framing, God knows what they've been doing, but they shipped out the work, or so he told us. They were going to ship out the work to a big communications agency that was going to do the data processing and make it into a readable report from everyone's submissions. I don't know why that's taken 2 years. I sort of assumed it was never going to come out by this point. I kept on thinking, where's that report? Why haven't they done that to us yet, you know? But it landed in the Home Office just before Christmas, and he's been sort of drip feeding bits from it into the media, which we've talked about those just now. Maybe there'll be more, I don't know. And I'm not sure when the report is going to become sort of available for more people to see, but when it is, I will have a copy.
Look forward to hearing about that. It will be really interesting. It seems almost all our episodes, we always come back to the same story, which is the power of dark money funded think tanks and their influence over our government and the media in this country. We did a couple of episodes back where we talked about the Atlas Network, which is a global network of these funders. If you're interested in this corruption of our democratic processes by oligarchs, and we don't know who, but by big dark money, then do have a look at that episode. And yeah, it's been brilliant to chat to you as ever, Claire.
Yeah,
thanks very much, and we'll see you again soon for another show.
See you soon.